The Vance family spent 40 years building a totally flawless Connecticut dynasty. It took just one 5x 11-inch piece of paper to burn it all down. Do you want to know the absolute funniest part of this entire disaster? My mother-in-law Eleanor actually paid $199 to light the match herself. She publicly demanded a newborn DNA test to prove my supposed infidelity. Instead, that tiny kit completely destroyed her own 40-year marriage forever. I would genuinely love to say I felt sorry for her downfall. I didn't. What I felt was just incredibly satisfied. Let me back you up exactly 2 months before the empire collapsed into a pile of expensive ash. It started on a perfectly manicured Sunday morning in late September, the kind of day that looks like a country club advertisement. I was 28 years old, running on 2 hours of broken sleep, and navigating the suffocating fog of undiagnosed postpartum depression. My son Leo was barely 8 weeks old, swaddled tightly against my chest as we pulled up to the Vance family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The driveway was lined with imported European gravel that crunched under the tires like breaking bones, welcoming us to their sacred weekly tradition of Sunday brunch. Here is what you need to understand about Eleanor Vance before I explain what she did at that dining table. She was 62 years old, built entirely out of passive-aggressive comments, inherited trust funds, and a terrifying obsession with preserving her pure, aristocratic bloodline. I was a freelance graphic designer who grew up in a working-class neighborhood where people actually ate carbohydrates and laughed loudly. Eleanor never explicitly called me trash to my face, but she had an Olympic-level talent for making me feel like a stray dog tracking mud onto her rugs. Every interaction we had was a carefully choreographed dance designed to remind me that I was a temporary guest in their prestigious history. The brunch was laid out on a massive mahogany dining table that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a home. Silver platters of smoked salmon sat untouched, while the heavy silence in the room stretched so tight you could practically play it like a guitar string. I was desperately trying to bounce a fussy Leo on my knee, while pretending to chew a piece of dry toast in my exhausted mouth. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, sipping her mimosa and staring at my baby with cold, calculating eyes. She didn't see a newborn child needing comfort. She saw a suspicious variable that threatened to contaminate her perfectly curated genetic masterpiece. But here is where it gets incredibly interesting, because Eleanor was never a woman who believed in subtle hints or private conversations. Without breaking eye contact with me, she reached into her designer leather handbag and pulled out a brightly colored cardboard box. She tossed it casually across the polished wood, letting it slide until it hit the edge of my water glass with a sharp thud. I looked down at the bright packaging of a standard 23andMe DNA testing kit, feeling my stomach plummet straight through the hardwood floor. The air in the room instantly evaporated, leaving me gasping for a breath that suddenly felt entirely impossible to catch. She placed her crystal champagne flute down with deliberate precision and leaned forward, her manicured fingers interlaced beneath her chin. This child has completely ordinary brown eyes, and absolutely zero trace of the prominent scholarly Vance nose that defines our family, she announced smoothly. The Vance family has spent decades building a legacy, and we certainly do not intend to squander our resources raising a cuckoo bird in our nest. I sat there paralyzed, clutching my crying infant tighter to my chest while the sheer audacity of her accusation washed over me. She was publicly calling me a cheap adulteress in front of the delicate floral centerpieces and the untouched hollandaise sauce. I looked desperately across the table at my husband Mark, waiting for him to slam his fist down and defend his exhausted wife. Instead, he just stared intently at his plate, pushing a piece of scrambled egg around with his silver fork like a coward avoiding a battlefield. Eleanor smiled a razor-thin smile, recognizing her son's pathetic silence as the ultimate victory in her long-waged war against my presence. "You will swab that child's cheek and send it to the laboratory by tomorrow morning, or Mark will file for divorce and leave you penniless," she declared softly. The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute, pinning me to my expensive velvet chair while my world fractured. I could feel the hot, humiliating tears pricking the corners of my eyes, but I swallowed my pride so deeply it physically ached. I was entirely financially dependent on them while on maternity leave, recovering from a traumatic birth, and fighting a terrifying psychological war. I slowly reached out with a trembling hand, my fingers wrapping around the smooth cardboard of the testing kit as if picking up a weapon. I didn't know it yet, but grabbing that box was the very first step toward a devastating retaliation they couldn't comprehend. I tucked the kit into my diaper bag, nodded silently at the woman trying to ruin my life, and quietly promised myself revenge. The car ride back to our apartment that afternoon was suffocatingly quiet and endlessly tense. Mark kept his eyes rigidly glued to the leather steering wheel the entire agonizing time. I waited patiently for him to apologize for his mother's absolutely horrific and public behavior. He simply turned up the radio volume and completely ignored my visibly shattered state. When we finally walked through our front door, my husband finally decided to speak. Did he pull me into his arms and promise to protect our new family from her malice? Absolutely not, because that would require actual emotional spine. He casually suggested that taking the ridiculous test was just the easiest way to keep the peace. He framed his cowardice as a simple logical compromise rather than a massive marital betrayal. Here is what you need to understand about the quintessential American golden boy. Mark had spent his entire privileged life coasting comfortably on his family's significant wealth. Standing up to Eleanor meant risking his comfortable position within the lucrative family trust fund. His supposed loyalty was always tethered directly to his future bank account balance, never to his wedding vows. I sat completely alone in the dimly lit nursery while little Leo finally slept in his crib. The crushing weight of my husband's profound cowardice pressed heavily against my tired chest. But here is where my perspective on the entire miserable situation completely shifted. The devastating hurt suddenly evaporated into the shadows, leaving behind a crystalline and absolute freezing clarity. Why was I desperately crying over a spineless man who actively refused to defend me? I realized in that dark room that this marriage was already a hollow and decaying shell. I no longer needed his pathetic validation or his family's grudging acceptance anyway. I wiped my stained face and looked at the brightly colored cardboard box sitting on the wooden dresser. It was no longer an insulting weapon meant to systematically destroy my personal reputation. It was actually a premium front-row ticket to the greatest theatrical performance of their miserable lives. I wasn't going to take this DNA test to desperately prove my innocence to them. I was going to take it because I wanted to watch them eventually choke on the unarguable results. A strange and highly comforting calmness settled deeply into my exhausted bones right in that moment. The terrified and weeping young mother they saw at brunch was officially gone forever. In her place was a patient observer who thoroughly understood the rules of their ugly game. Would they really be prepared for the absolute reality of their own blinding scientific arrogance? I walked quietly out into the living room, where Mark was nervously drinking a craft beer. He looked up defensively, clearly expecting me to start another exhausting and highly emotional argument. Instead, I simply smiled at him with a perfectly practiced and completely empty facial expression. I confidently told him I would happily provide the requested saliva sample first thing in the morning. He visibly exhaled a huge sigh of relief, thinking he had successfully managed the annoying crisis. He just didn't know yet that he was enthusiastically sealing his own permanent and devastating fate. Monday morning arrived with the sterile brightness of a hospital room waiting for a terminal diagnosis. I sat on our upholstered living room sofa, with the $199 23andMe kit resting on the coffee table. Mark stood aggressively by the kitchen island, drinking espresso while monitoring my movements like a highly paid warden. I extracted the plastic swab from its sterile packaging and gently rubbed it against my sleeping baby's cheek. Once the microscopic evidence of his lineage was secured inside the vial, I sealed it inside the provided biohazard bag. We walked together in silence to the blue United States Postal Service box, sitting on the corner of our street. Mark insisted on physically dropping the prepaid envelope into the metal slot himself to ensure I did not tamper with the evidence. The heavy door clanged shut with a loud metallic echo that sounded like a judge bringing down a wooden gavel. According to the glossy pamphlet inside the testing kit, we were facing a mandatory waiting period of 3 to 4 weeks. Those impending weeks stretched out before us like a vast psychological desert designed to break whatever fragments of my spirit still remained. During that agonizing waiting period, my mother-in-law meticulously laid the groundwork for what she believed would be my public suburban execution. She started dropping specific comments during our weekly phone calls about finally having the opportunity to redecorate Mark's home office soon. Eleanor even went so far as to recommend a fiercely expensive divorce attorney to Mark, under the guise of protecting his assets. She was operating with the terrifying confidence of a wealthy woman who had never once in her privileged life been proven factually wrong. Every fake smile and condescending piece of parenting advice she offered me was laced with the intoxicating anticipation of my impending destruction. But here is where it gets incredibly interesting, and this specific detail requires a brief detour into the digital history of the Vance family. Here is what you need to understand about my quiet father-in-law, Richard Vance, who had built the family empire from the ground up. Approximately 5 years before this entire disaster started, Richard developed a mild obsession with tracing his distant aristocratic Scottish genealogical roots. He happily purchased the exact same premium testing kit, submitted his saliva sample, and permanently uploaded his genetic sequence to their database. Richard's complete DNA profile had been sitting securely on their massive corporate servers for half a decade, simply waiting to connect with relatives. The commercial genetic platform includes a popular feature called DNA Relatives, which automatically cross-references your uploaded sample against their entire global network. When you register a brand new testing kit, the algorithmic system immediately attempts to match your specific chromosomes with any biologically related family members. Therefore, the moment my newborn son's genetic data finished processing, the sophisticated software would instantly begin searching for his ancestors. If Leo was truly Mark's biological child, the platform would unequivocally confirm a direct and undeniable genetic link to his grandfather Richard. The scientific mechanism of the trap was infallible, requiring absolutely nothing from me, except the quiet patience to let the system execute perfectly. I spent the remaining days of November playing the role of the terrified and anxious daughter-in-law they desperately expected to see. I kept my head bowed appropriately low during gatherings, allowing them to comfortably marinate in their overwhelming sense of impending moral superiority. Mark treated me with the cold professionalism of a corporate manager preparing to fire a completely incompetent and dishonest entry-level employee. The silence inside our apartment rode shotgun with us every single day, acting like a grim hitchhiker who knew exactly our destination. I did not argue with him, I did not cry in his presence, and I never tried to convince him of my absolute loyalty. Exactly 26 days after we dropped that fateful envelope into the postal box, the automated notification arrived in Mark's encrypted email inbox. We were standing in our designer kitchen on a chilly Wednesday evening when his smartphone loudly vibrated against the dark granite countertop. The subject line was crisp and detached, stating that the comprehensive genetic health and ancestry results for Leo Vance were officially ready. Mark aggressively snatched the device from the counter, his thumb hovering over the digital notification that held the absolute power to ruin me. However, Eleanor had previously issued strict instructions that the highly anticipated results must be opened together during the Thanksgiving holiday dinner. Thanksgiving Day finally arrived in Connecticut with a bitter and freezing winter wind. The massive Greenwich estate was completely overflowing with loud and wealthy extended family members. Various aunts, uncles, and distant cousins packed tightly into the lavish formal dining room. Was this massive holiday gathering just a happy and innocent family coincidence? Eleanor had deliberately invited every single relative for this specific holiday dinner. She wanted the absolute largest possible audience for my impending public humiliation. A private email reveal inside our quiet apartment just wasn't cruel enough for her. She desperately needed a grand theatrical stage to showcase her ultimate final victory. She sat proudly at the head of the long mahogany dining table. Her expensive crystal wine glass sparkled brightly under the vintage chandelier lights. She smiled directly at me like a starving cat watching a trapped mouse. But the arrogant matriarch truly did not know what was coming for her yet. What if my vicious mother-in-law had simply opened that electronic document privately beforehand? She could have easily buried the devastating family secret deep in the ground forever. She could have quietly protected her supposedly flawless 40-year marriage from total destruction. Instead, she actively chose to weaponize a highly traditional American holiday gathering. Now listen carefully to the sheer terrifying depth of her unchecked personal arrogance. Her intense desire to publicly destroy a vulnerable young mother completely blinded her logic. She carelessly traded her own secure financial future for pure and malicious petty spite. Would she ever actually recover from this monumental and entirely avoidable Thanksgiving miscalculation? The beautifully roasted turkey sat perfectly carved on a polished vintage silver platter. However, nobody was actually paying any attention to the incredibly expensive holiday food. Every single wealthy guest was staring directly at Mark's aggressively glowing smartphone screen. The mounting tension inside the dining room was completely suffocating and overwhelmingly heavy. Eleanor gently tapped her heavy silver spoon against her delicate crystal water glass. The light holiday chatter immediately died down into a terrifyingly cold, dead silence. She proudly announced to the room that it was time to clear the air. She was practically vibrating with vicious excitement and a highly uncontrolled nervous energy. Mark slowly pulled his phone from his expensive tailored suit jacket pocket. He looked over at his mother, seeking her final nod of absolute approval. Did they really believe their elite genetic legacy was entirely untouchable and pure? Mark slowly connected his smartphone to the television screen. The massive display suddenly flashed a bright blue color. Every single wealthy guest leaned forward in their seats. Eleanor sat perfectly straight in her expensive dining chair. She held her vintage crystal wine glass extremely tightly. She was absolutely ready for my public suburban execution. Mark nervously tapped the digital mail application icon. The little loading circle spun slowly on the screen. My own heart beat surprisingly calmly in my chest. The encrypted PDF document finally opened for everyone. The black font was incredibly large and bold. The first printed line was simply scientifically undeniable. It legally confirmed Leo was Mark's true biological son. We had a flawless and perfect genetic match today. There was absolutely no secret cheating involved at all. Eleanor gasped loudly across the massive mahogany table. Her smug facial expression vanished almost instantly. She looked completely terrified and utterly confused. Mark let out a massive sigh of relief. He looked at me with a somewhat apologetic gaze. I simply ignored his pathetic and cowardly face. He actually thought the awful holiday drama was over. He reached out to close the mobile application, but the real secret was hiding right there. I calmly told him to scroll down the page. My speaking voice was completely flat and totally cold. He slowly swiped his thumb across the bright screen. The second document page loaded onto the large television. This was the family relative matching section. The digital algorithm had done its job perfectly. It aggressively scanned the massive global genetic database. It analyzed millions of complex human chromosome patterns. It located Richard Vance's old archived DNA profile. The advanced system compared the two adult male samples. Mark stared blankly at the newly generated genetic data. A bright red warning box appeared suddenly on screen. The translated digital text was brutally clear and concise. Mark shared absolutely zero DNA with Richard Vance. They were not biologically related to each other. The famous aristocratic bloodline was a complete fabricated lie. The golden boy of Connecticut was an absolute fraud. The entire dining room stopped breathing at the same time. Nobody dared to make a single sound right now. The sudden silence was incredibly heavy and deeply suffocating. It felt exactly like a loaded physical weapon. Richard slowly placed his expensive silver fork down. His wrinkled hands were shaking with pure, uncontrolled rage. He slowly turned his head to look at Eleanor. My quiet father-in-law did not yell or scream loudly. He just stared directly at his secretly cheating wife. 40 years of loyal marriage evaporated instantly tonight. Eleanor turned pale like a literal terrified ghost. Her manicured hands violently grabbed the wooden dining table. She opened her mouth to speak defensively to him. No coherent words came out of her dry throat. The undeniable scientific proof was right there for everyone. It was proudly displayed in bright, high definition. Her incredibly cruel trap had completely backfired on her. She had personally paid to expose her own infidelity. She systematically destroyed her own wealthy suburban kingdom. Mark dropped his expensive phone onto the hardwood floor. The glass screen shattered into tiny little sharp pieces. He looked exactly like a terrified little crying boy. His entire privileged identity was permanently erased today. He was certainly no longer the sole family heir. He was just a random and unfortunate biological mistake. Shocked relatives started whispering furiously to each other. Several wealthy aunts quickly looked away in deep shame. The perfect family image was completely and totally shattered. Are you wondering what I did next? I sat quietly in my comfortable velvet dining chair. I absolutely did not feel any pity for them. I slowly reached for my glass of red wine. The vintage alcohol tasted incredibly sweet and satisfying tonight. I took a long and extremely deliberate dark sip. I watched the mighty aristocratic empire burn down. The flames were completely invisible, but incredibly destructive. Science had finally delivered the ultimate absolute justice. The rest of the devastating evening unfolded exactly the way real consequences happen when arrogant people face the absolute undeniable truth. Richard Vance quietly stood up from the extravagant dining table and walked out of his lavish mansion without uttering a single word. He immediately contacted his elite corporate lawyers to officially file for an aggressive divorce the very following Monday morning. This swift and merciless legal action effectively locked down every single joint bank account, and permanently froze the lucrative family trust funds. Eleanor was legally evicted from the sprawling Greenwich estate she had fiercely ruled like an untouchable tyrannical queen for 4 undisputed decades. She desperately tried to salvage her shattered social reputation, but nobody in that highly judgmental suburban community wanted to associate with a messy aristocratic fraud. Now listen carefully to how the mighty golden boy completely fell from grace, because his personal downfall was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. Mark discovered very quickly that his supposed brilliant business acumen was entirely dependent on his wealthy father's influential last name and vast financial network. Once the official paternity results became widespread public knowledge within their elite inner circle, he was systematically and quietly removed from the executive board. He officially lost his luxury apartment, his country club memberships, and his guaranteed place in the prestigious lineage he constantly bragged about. My spineless former husband currently works a completely mediocre, mid-level management job in an entirely different state. He permanently traded his golden financial inheritance just to appease his incredibly bitter and highly manipulative mother. As for my own personal situation, I confidently packed my belongings the very next morning and walked away from their toxic environment with my son. I hired a phenomenal family attorney who easily secured a highly favorable divorce settlement for me without enduring a lengthy and painful court battle. Mark possessed a sudden and extreme desperation to quickly finalize everything quietly, which gave my legal team the absolute upper hand in all financial negotiations. I never asked for a single penny of the Vance family wealth because building my independent graphic design business was infinitely more satisfying. Leo is currently thriving in a peaceful, loving, and completely normal household where nobody will ever measure his inherent worth by his genetics. I successfully escaped a suffocating lifetime of psychological abuse simply by letting their massive egos self-destruct. Looking back at the entire chaotic ordeal, the sheer profound irony of the situation still makes me smile warmly over my morning coffee every single day. Eleanor was so fundamentally consumed by her desperate need to prove I was a deceitful outsider that she completely forgot about her own monumental historical lies. She willingly handed me the exact scientific weapon needed to systematically dismantle her entire privileged universe, while assuming she was playing a brilliant game of chess. She truly believed she was strategically cornering a completely defenseless opponent, but she was actually digging her own permanent and incredibly deep financial grave. The most dangerous mistake a powerful predator can ever make is foolishly assuming the quiet prey sitting across the table isn't secretly keeping their own precise and unforgiving score. She aggressively demanded absolute biological perfection from a tired working-class mother who just wanted peace and quiet. Science ultimately held up a harsh and unforgiving mirror to her own deeply flawed and highly hypocritical reflection instead, forcing her to finally face reality. Some incredibly ambitious men and women spend their entire lives carefully building magnificent financial kingdoms and strategically securing their legacy for many generations to come. Eleanor Vance spent 40 long years building a supposedly flawless aristocratic dynasty in Connecticut, and she burned it straight to the ground on a Thursday night. She permanently lost her loyal husband, her vast inherited fortune, and her prestigious social standing over a single printed piece of standard office paper. She lost absolutely everything purely out of her own blinding arrogance, because she could not resist bullying her exhausted daughter-in-law. It truly takes a very special kind of foolishness to literally pay a commercial genetics company to enthusiastically ruin your own seemingly perfect and wealthy suburban life. 2 months of enduring absolute misery finally ended, because one incredibly patient woman knew exactly how to let a vicious narcissist completely destroy herself. The universe has a remarkably funny way of delivering absolute karma to terrible people who genuinely believe they are hovering entirely above the basic rules. A massive corporate empire built on 40 years of carefully constructed deception can instantly crumble if you simply provide the correct scientific match. If you genuinely enjoyed listening to this story of ultimate revenge, please consider joining our growing community by hitting that subscribe button and leaving a comment below.